Before I begin, I want you to close your eyes for just one moment. Picture the most patient person you have ever known. Now ask yourself, what made them that patient? What did they have to survive, to endure, to absorb in silence, to develop that kind of stillness? Because patience that deep does not come from a calm life. It comes from a life that tried to destroy someone and failed. Now open your eyes, because what I am about to tell you is not a story about revenge. It is not a story about violence. It is not even, at its core, a story about 7 men who made the worst mistake of their lives. It is a story about what happens when the world breaks the wrong person. When you silence someone who was never meant to stay silent. When you wound someone who was always going to survive the wound. When you walk away from a moment of cruelty, laughing, certain, absolutely certain, that you will never see consequences. This is a story about that certainty being shattered. 15 years later, one name at a time. So before we go any further, understand this clearly. The most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. It is the quietest one, the one sitting still, saying nothing, watching everything, who has already decided what comes next. Trauma is not simply an event that happens to a person. It is something that happens inside a person, reshaping the very architecture of who they are. When a human being experiences violence, violation, or profound humiliation, the mind and body respond in ways that science is only beginning to fully understand. The nervous system records the experience not merely as a memory, but as a living sensation that can be triggered, relived, and felt again with startling intensity even decades later. This is why trauma survivors often describe their pain not in the past tense but in the present, because for them, it never truly left. Survival, however, is a different conversation entirely. To survive trauma is not simply to remain alive after it. Survival is an active, ongoing, and deeply personal process of continuing to exist in a world that once turned violently against you. Some survivors collapse inward, withdrawing from relationships, from trust, from any situation that reminds them of their pain. Others become consumed by anger that has nowhere healthy to go. But there exists another category of survivor, one who transforms, one who takes the rawest, most destructive experience of their life and refuses to let it be the final word on who they are. These survivors do not pretend the wound does not exist. They carry it, but they carry it forward, not backward. They convert suffering into fuel, violation into vision, and humiliation into an unrelenting drive that those who have never been broken can barely comprehend. Trauma, in this sense, does not destroy them. It defines the next version of them, and that version is often the most powerful one. There is a profound and painful gap that exists between what the law promises and what victims actually receive. Legal systems, however well-intentioned, are built on procedures, evidence, requirements, political pressures, and social biases that often work against the very people they claim to protect. A woman violated by men of power, men of influence, or men who simply know how to manipulate a system frequently finds herself facing not justice but a second humiliation, one administered not with physical force but with paperwork, skepticism, and institutional indifference. She is questioned about her credibility. Her past is examined. Her pain is measured against standards she never agreed to. And in far too many cases, the verdict delivered by that system is silence. The case dropped. The perpetrators unpunished. The victim left to absorb the message that what happened to her did not matter enough. But here is what those systems fail to account for. Justice is not only something that institutions dispense, it is something that the human spirit demands, relentlessly, across time, across obstacles, across years. When official channels close their doors, something else awakens in the person who was wronged. A private tribunal begins to form, one with no judge but memory, no jury but conscience, and no statute of limitations whatsoever. This internal court does not adjourn. It does not lose paperwork. It does not forget faces or let powerful connections influence its proceedings. It simply waits for the moment when the wronged person is ready, capable, and positioned to act. The delay in justice, therefore, does not represent the death of justice. It represents its postponement, and a postponed reckoning, when it finally arrives, often arrives with a force and completeness that no rushed verdict could ever achieve. Silence is one of the most misread conditions in human experience. When a victim goes quiet after suffering a grave injustice, the world around them often interprets that silence as acceptance, as weakness, as proof that perhaps the wound was not as deep as claimed, or worse, that perhaps nothing truly happened at all. Society has a long and deeply troubling history of mistaking a victim's silence for consent after the fact, for forgiveness, for moving on. But this interpretation is not only wrong, it is dangerously, catastrophically wrong. The silence of the wronged is rarely chosen freely. It is most often imposed by fear of not being believed, by the social cost of speaking out, by the very real threat of retaliation from those who hold power, and by an exhaustion so profound that the idea of fighting a world that has already shown its willingness to look away feels utterly impossible. For women in particular, and especially for women in positions that society already marginalizes or romanticizes into passivity, such as religious life, the silence is enforced by layers of expectation. They are supposed to forgive. They are supposed to pray. They are supposed to rise above. These expectations, however spiritually framed, function as a cage, trapping the victim inside a performance of grace while the perpetrators walk free. But silence, when it is not chosen but forced, does not represent peace. It represents pressure. Pressure that builds, accumulates, and stores itself with extraordinary efficiency. Everything that cannot be said is not lost. It is held. And what is held for long enough, with enough intensity, becomes something entirely different from grief. It becomes clarity. It becomes purpose. It becomes the quiet engine of everything that follows. In a culture that celebrates immediate reaction, that rewards the loudest voice, the fastest response, the most visible display of emotion, patience is profoundly underestimated as a form of strength. We are conditioned to believe that power announces itself, that strength is demonstrated through speed and volume, that the person who responds first and most forcefully is the one who holds the advantage. This conditioning is not only shallow, it is strategically naive, because the most effective power in human history has rarely been the kind that explodes outward immediately. It has been the kind that waits, watches, and moves only when the conditions are perfectly aligned. Patience of the kind born from deep personal suffering is unlike ordinary patience. It is not the patience of someone waiting for a bus or tolerating a slow process. It is a disciplined, almost meditative state of sustained intention, the ability to hold a goal in focus across months, years, and even decades, without losing the thread, without being distracted by the temptation to act prematurely, without allowing the natural erosion of time to wear down the sharpness of purpose. This kind of patience requires an extraordinary level of self-mastery. It requires the ability to function normally in the world, to speak, to smile, to exist alongside the very people who wronged you, while internally maintaining an absolute, unwavering commitment to a future moment of reckoning. Those who underestimate a patient person make a fundamental error in judgment. They see the stillness and conclude that the storm has passed. They see the calm face and assume the fire has gone out. They carry on with their lives, growing more careless with every passing year, more convinced of their own safety. And in doing so, they hand their patient adversary the greatest possible gift: complete and total surprise. There is a principle woven into virtually every culture, every spiritual tradition, and every system of moral philosophy that has ever existed on this earth. Actions produce consequences. It goes by different names: karma, divine judgment, moral causality, cosmic justice, but the underlying idea is always the same. What a person does not simply vanish into the air after it is done. It attaches itself to them. It follows them. It waits in the structure of reality itself for the moment when the scales must be balanced. This is not merely a religious or philosophical concept. It is a psychological and social truth. People who commit acts of great cruelty rarely escape entirely unaltered. Even when legal systems fail, even when social structures protect the guilty, the effects of what was done ripple outward in ways that cannot always be predicted or controlled. But the reckoning we speak of here is far more personal and far more precise than abstract cosmic justice. It is the reckoning delivered by a specific person with specific knowledge, specific motivation, and specific capability. Someone who has spent years doing nothing but preparing for this exact moment. When that kind of reckoning arrives, it does not arrive with the chaos of impulsive revenge. It arrives with the terrible clarity of someone who has had 15 years to think about every detail, to anticipate every obstacle, to close every possible escape route. The perpetrators, who have had years to become complacent, are completely unprepared for this. They built their comfort on the assumption that enough time makes a person safe. They confused the victim's silence with forgetting. They mistook her absence from their lives for absence from the equation entirely. The reckoning corrects all of these assumptions simultaneously, and it does so in a way that cannot be undone, disputed, or escaped. Pain, at its most intense and most sustained, does one of two things to a human being. It either destroys them, gradually dismantling their sense of self, their will to engage with the world, their capacity for hope, or it transforms them into something that could never have existed without the suffering. This second outcome is not guaranteed. It is not automatic. It does not happen simply because time passes or because a person is inherently strong. It happens because somewhere in the depths of their darkest experience, a person makes, consciously or unconsciously, a fundamental decision about what their pain will mean. They decide that it will not be the period at the end of their sentence. They decide it will be the turning point in a longer, more complex, more powerful story. Transformation through pain is not the same as healing. Healing implies a return to a former state, a restoration of what was lost. But some experiences are so fundamentally shattering that there is no former state to return to. The person who existed before the trauma is simply gone. What transformation offers instead is not restoration but reinvention, the emergence of an entirely new identity, forged in the fire of the worst thing that ever happened, and precisely because of that fire, harder, sharper, more purposeful, and more capable than anything that came before. The woman who endured what she endured did not emerge from 15 years as a softened, healed version of her former self. She emerged as something the 7 men who hurt her could never have imagined when they looked at her, because what they saw was a victim, and what she had become through every year of silence and suffering and deliberate self-reconstruction was something they had no category for and no defense against.